Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Julian Cox, Deputy Director and Chief Curator, and welcome to this evening's special discussion about the exhibition Haegue Yang Emergence, which just opened to our public a few days ago on October the 1st. And tonight's event is a special opportunity to hear from our AGO curator of the exhibition, Adelina Vlas, and Stuart Comer, who is the Lonti Ebers Chief Curator of Media and Performance at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And we're really happy and grateful to have you along, Stuart. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is an enormously ambitious project, one we're extremely proud of. It involves two fabulous new commissions, and I'd like to extend thanks to a generous community of supporters who made this project possible for us. There are loans from 80 different works of art from Europe, North America, and Asia. A real feat to bring everything together during the time of COVID. So I want to thank everybody. There's several people on this call who've been instrumental in helping to make that happen. Importantly to our sponsors, thank you to our presenting sponsor and partner, Max Mara. Lead support has been very generously provided by Eleanor and Francis Shen. We've also had very generous support from Lonti Ebers and the Korea Foundation, generous assistance from Cecily and Robert Bradshaw, the Schulich Foundation, Lisa Mauer and Andrew Shiner, and very generous collective support from the Women's Art Initiative, and also contemporary programming at the AGO has been supported by the Canada Council for the Arts. I'd also like to extend a special welcome along with our gratitude to representatives from Max Mara and members of the Women's Art Initiative, a very dynamic group here at the AGO that has been unfailingly supportive of a whole slew of important projects that we've done in the last few years dedicated to the work of women artists, and they've been instrumental in both the exhibition and the commission and bringing those two elements into fruition. And I'd also finally like to thank and acknowledge the lenders to the exhibition. I mentioned there are more than 80 works of art, and a few of them are here with us this evening. You see Carol Green on the call. Thank you, Carol. And I think a few others have joined us as well. And you can see the list here on the screen shared by Adelina. Anyway, I'm very grateful to all of you. Everybody who's here on this call this evening has been instrumental in one way or another in supporting this effort, and we're really grateful to have you all here this evening to hear a little bit from Adelina and Stuart, who are going to share their insight into Haegue's work, and in particular really talk about the particular resonance I think that it has in our current moment. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Adelina and to Stuart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julian, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Supporters, lenders, this wouldn't have been possible without your generous contributions, and the exhibition looks beautiful. It's everyone who's walked through it is impressed with the results, and we hope that at some point before the end of January, all of you will be able to come and see it in person. This evening, we have a very special guest, distinguished colleague and accomplished curator, Stuart Comer. And Stuart, as Julian mentioned, is the Lonti Ebers Chief Curator of Media and Performance at the Museum of Modern Arts, where he oversees the collection and diverse program of exhibition, events, and acquisitions for the Department of Media and Performance. He also leads the Marie-José and Henry Kravis Studio, the museum's new space dedicated to performance, music, sound, spoken words, and expanded approaches to the moving image. Since his appointment in 2013, in addition to helping reconceive the museum's collection galleries, Stuart's projects at MoMA have included Pulp L, 1978 to 2001, in 2019, Haegue Yang Handles in last year, 2019 to 2020, Tania Bruguera, Untitled, Inbox, Steve McQueen, Inbox, Charles Atlas, and Alexandra Bathiasis, Massacre, Variations on a Theme in 2017. And that's just to name a few of them. He's currently organizing Adam Pendleton, Who is Queen, a major commission for the Marin Atrium opening in September of 2021. And he's co-curating the forthcoming exhibition Signals, the Politics of Video. Stuart was co-curator of the Whitney Museum of American Art 2014 biennial, and from 2004 to 2013 served as the first curator of film at Tate Modern, London, where he oversaw film and video work for the Tate collection and displays, and co-curated the opening program of the Tanks at Tate Modern, which also included Haegue Yang. Mr. Comer received a bachelor's in 1990 in art history from Carleton College in Minnesota and attended the Curating Contemporary Art MA at Royal College of Arts in London, where he graduated in 2002, only a few years before me. So he's also a former student of the Royal College. So thank you so much, Stuart, for joining us this evening. The way we're going to do this is that, as you can see already on the screen, Stuart is going to walk us through his recent project and collaboration with Haegue Yang, which opened last October, and actually was still on view when MoMA closed in early March, and as well as other works that have performative elements. And then at the end, we will, once he finishes his presentation, we will talk a little bit about the resonance of those projects in the exhibition here at the AGO, and we will welcome your questions and an open conversation. So here we go.
Thank you so much, Adelina, and I'm really delighted to be invited to join all of you this evening. And I mean, further to Julian's point, I mean, it's such a major feat to achieve any Haegue Yang exhibition, but particularly in the middle of a major international pandemic. My hat is really off to you for opening last week, and I really hope I get a chance to come up to see it before too long. So it's very encouraging to know that these kinds of things are in fact opening right now. But why don't we jump to the next slide, Adelina? And I hope some of you might have had a chance to see this project when it did open almost a year ago. And we were really thrilled to be able to reopen it when we did open a little over a month ago following the quarantine period here in New York. But it was a very exciting project for us that really kind of anchored many of the changes that we were trying to communicate when we reopened MoMA's expansion last October. And I know many of these issues are probably very much at the heart of Adelina and the curatorial team's thinking at the AGO too, but the degree to which I think Haegue really asks us to rethink models of translation, of kind of a global model that really breaks down historical categories that have been quite rigid and really opens them up in a very rigorous but playful way. So it really brings together histories that normally might not have anything to do with each other and creates very exciting new possibilities out of those kinds of collages and very experiential works. So as you all know by now, I'm sure the work doesn't tend to only be objects or two-dimensional works, but also installations that involve smell, light, sound, and a number of other qualities. But Adelina asked if I would focus this evening specifically on the more performative elements of this piece. And the activation of the sculptures is something that has been unfolding over a number of years in Haegue's work. And I really came, I think, to a peak in Handels here at MoMA. And I know it's a way that she plans to continue working for a number of projects coming up. Next slide, please, Adelina. This gives you a slightly more a broad look at the whole atrium. And then next slide. Looking in the other direction, you see she really used the full scale of the space. And Haegue is a very sophisticated spatial thinker, and it was really exciting working with her both in the space when she was able to come to New York, but also very virtually, even before we were all forced to go even more virtual because of the pandemic. But she really was an incredible problem solver and thinking through not just the objects themselves, but how the wall pattern, how the movements of the objects could really help activate a very challenging space at the heart of MoMA's campus. So if you go to the next slide, please. So this is an earlier work, Salim, which I know is going to be included in the show at the AGO. And I wanted to show this in part also because this really derived from her own kitchen at a time in which her studio and her apartment were one, and she was working at a very different scale. But even then, you begin to kind of see how she could take even the most mundane domestic object or space and give it a sort of performative stage-like potential that would really translate and transform these more humble objects and situations into something really dynamic. Also with the sort of kinetic fan and other elements that really kind of make this a more animated object than a traditional sculpture might have been. Next slide, please. And she's also continued this way of working for a number of years, especially when she began to work with these level-or blinds and would really animate them with moving lights, again, with smell and incense and other ways of making them very experiential encounters that really transcended static objects and made something far more immersive and dynamic and spatially complex. Again, the lighting, again, evokes a stage. I mean, they're very theatrical and very performative. Next slide, please. She continued to work with light in particular and also began to really examine mobility. And she's had a long-standing interest in mobility, both in terms of her own experience as someone who's lived across cultures and across continents, in Germany and South Korea in particular. And she really manifests that kind of thinking in objects like this. And for a number of years, she's been working to make these objects move around the space, and often through the use of facilitators who would actually kind of choreograph them in the gallery. Next slide, please. The dress vehicles that you see here in a recent presentation in Milan. I was lucky enough when we were working at Tate to launch the tanks in 2012. My colleague Catherine Wood at the time also did a presentation of an early body of dress vehicles in the tanks. And at the time, Haegue was also, she included a drum kit that any member of the public was allowed to come and play the drums or sing into the microphone, and that would then trigger the movements of the lights in the space. So again, not only were the objects mobile, but the lighting was really dependent on an interactive process with the viewer, and it made it a really exciting experience. But this really kind of stuck in my mind in terms of this fusion of dance, choreography, and other forms of movement, and a more traditional notion of objecthood and sculpture. Next slide, please. So one of the things that also has continued to really percolate in Haegue's work is a strong interest in the Bauhaus. And certainly as we began to think about MoMA and its own history of modernism, and how we might shift that a bit and think about it a bit differently, particularly when we reopened the expansion last year, Haegue's work really came to mind because she's been very playful about directly addressing the legacy of figures like Oskar Schlemmer, and again, kind of fusing man and machine and object and movement, and almost these sort of proto-early 20th century cyborgs, which somehow felt very right for this moment. Next slide, please. Schlemmer, of course, was as known for his ballets and his work in dance as he was for these incredible objects and, again, fusions and hybrids of different forms that often seem quite robotic. But the dances themselves were extremely magical, and the triadic ballet is certainly the best known one, particularly through this film version of it that was shot a number of years after it was first produced. Next slide, please. So Haegue made a direct reference to Schlemmer and to his work in ballet in the Boxing Ballet, which is happily on view at the AGO now. And again, she was really thinking about the choreography and the movements of these objects in space, and really thinking too about the hybridity of Schlemmer's own work, where you couldn't really fix it just in the realm of art or design or architecture, but like so many figures that emerged from the Bauhaus, really thinking about a future and a world that was rooted in machine thinking, but that really allowed these forms to be more hybrid and more dynamic. Next slide, please. Here you see Haegue herself standing with one of the objects, and the bells that you see, and I'll go into more detail about this in a minute, but come out of Haegue's own fascination with Korean shamanism. And that had a direct bearing on the project that we've done here in the atrium. But the rituals in shamanism in Korea often dealt with these bells and rattles that would be shaken quite aggressively. And so she, over the last several years, has been developing these kinds of skins around these very industrial skeletons. And then when the objects are moved through space, they have this gorgeous shimmering sound from the jingle bells, or these kind of shamanistic bells. So this also became a point of interest as we began to evolve the project at MoMA. Next slide, please. But her interest in the Bauhaus has also extended more recently to Sophie Teuber-Arp in particular. And we're actually planning a major retrospective that will now open next year here at the museum. She was particularly interested in the coupe dada and these small objects that, again, really transcended conventional ideas of sculpture and were as much rooted in histories of design and also movement. And next slide, please. And one more. Toiber herself actually studied with the dance guru Laban and had a very deep fascination in dance and movement. And also, as you can see here in these vaguely Native American costumes, she was also particularly interested in indigenous cultures, as is Haegue, which I'll get onto in a moment. And then if you could go back a slide, sorry. She began to develop this series called the Sonic Coupes. And so she's now calling this sort of work with the Bells sonic sculptures. And so they do, she's particularly interested in how to animate their sonic potential as well as their sculptural potential. And so she began to make these direct references to Toiber Arp's coupes. And what's a little hard to tell on this photo, but the individual parts spin independently of one another. So just as the object might move laterally across the floor, it's also sort of spinning in multiple directions as it's animated. And you can see the handles on the sculpture are what lent the title to the show at MoMA, Handles. And Haegue really began to think about, what again would normally seem like a very mundane domestic object. But she began to think about how they really are the key factor that allows us to cross the threshold, whether it's opening or pushing a door, open or closed, or any number of ways that handles really do allow us to access other realms, other spaces, and other worlds. And this became a point of great fascination for her, and I think really allowed her to kind of rethink even just the terms of these sculptures and how they are animated and the amount of labor that is required by the facilitators to do that. Next, 2 slides ahead, please. One more. There we go. And this was a series that I actually first saw at Great Neftali here in New York. But again, as Haegue's interest in shamanism in Korea became even deeper, she began to look at a lot of different approaches to using raffia and other natural and organic materials that almost belied her earlier work that was so machine-like, or, again, sort of these ready-made objects from the domestic home, and began to work in much more fantastical forms using very traditional materials, quite divorced from something like the Bauhaus, although of course, even in the Bauhaus, you think of a figure like Annie Albers, who's also been an interesting point of reference for Haegue in terms of her work in textiles. Next slide, please. As she began to examine these shamanistic rituals, and as I mentioned, these bells, you see here that she was also looking at movement and kineticism in other forms, including these wall-based paintings or wall-based works that would literally spin around and again generate this gorgeous sound that the bells make. Next slide, please. Here you see one of the original Mudang bells, as they're called, which the shamans use in the rituals in Korea. Next slide. So as we began to develop this project, Toiber Arp, as I mentioned, was one key point of reference, as you see in the coupe on the left. And then her other fascination at the moment is G.I. Gurdjieff. And what's really interesting about Haegue's work increasingly is she will often make these almost biographical works about individual historical figures that she has a real fascination with. So Sol LeWitt is one major figure that she's often referenced in her work. But increasingly, I think she goes very deep in her research into the biographies of figures like Toiber Arp or Gurdjieff. And in the case of Gurdjieff, like Haegue herself, he was a figure, a mystic, who became sort of a major influence on a lot of self-improvement thinking, but also somebody who was actively knitting together cultures from both East and West, from the so-called Orient as much as from Europe. Really looking in particular at cultures in Turkey that were already very hybrid in terms of merging different geographies and different cultural histories. And she was particularly interested also in Gurdjieff's movements, much as she was also interested in Sophie Toiber Arp's work in dance. Next slide, please. And one more. So the gate that you just saw, as she calls it, derives specifically from Gurdjieff's fascination with the Enneagram, which is this star-like structure that also tended to determine many of the movements in his own movements that you see images of below. And if you go to the next slide. And here you see a more recent performance of those movements in Korea, in fact, just last year. So the Enneagram was really central to Haegue's thinking about both the objects themselves, especially the gate structure, but also the wall pattern that you see in the installation, where every single tile in that is sort of a broken down Enneagram. So she sort of deconstructed the Enneagram and then turned it into this fractal-like shimmering surface across the entire atrium that really further animates the whole situation. Next slide, please. So as we began to develop the project, we talked a lot about, how these works would be activated, how it might depart from some of the earlier work, like the dress vehicles. And while she had certainly worked, for instance, if you noticed in the earlier Schlemmer work and in the Boxing Ballet that's on view now at the AGO, there's a spiral on the floor. And so that spiral, to some degree, determined the movements of the objects in the space. But as she began to think more about the Enneagram and the challenges of the atrium, not only in terms of its scale, but at MoMA, as you probably know, we get very high volumes of traffic. And so the facilitators working with these objects needed to come up with a choreography that could really accommodate the large crowds as well as the challenges of the space itself. And she really wanted to kind of honor both Toiber Arp and Gurdjieff's own history with dance and movement, as well as thinking about geometry in a totally different way, not something that just sits on a two-dimensional surface or even as a sculptural object on the floor, but something that is animated. So the gate began her sort of thinking again about thresholds, points of passage, gateways, and then it really became one of the first objects she began to think of, that the choreography really involved passing through it before the entire dance would really begin. So we worked with the choreographer Jesse Gold, whom you see walking through the gate in this photo, who worked very closely with Haegue and our production team, led by Lizzie Gorfain here at the museum, to develop a really complex and sophisticated choreography. Next slide, please. Here you see a still from that, where there are moments when the dancers all sort of surround each object to sort of mark it in space, and then proceed to kind of file through the space. And then once each object is to some extent kind of honored in this ritualistic way, then they're actually activated and they start to move through the space. Next slide, please. Here you see a different set of the objects. Next slide, please. And here we should have a clip, just a little over a minute, that I'll share with you, and then I'll continue. So you could just barely make out the shimmer, I hope, in the video. And what you also heard in the background, and I'll go to the next slide when we get the PowerPoint back up. So there are sort of two other layers of sound in this work. And again, sound has also been really central to Haegue's work for a number of years, and particularly as she's begun to investigate the sonic sculptures. And I know that there's an element of this work also up at the AGO now. But for the several shows she's done recently, she's begun to incorporate the sound of birdsong. And this comes specifically out of this summit that was held between the leaders of North and South Korea in the demilitarized zone, which it turns out is also one of the most biodiverse and sort of rich regions in this part of Asia. And so there's a famous blue bridge where, as you see, the two leaders were meeting, and the press was strictly forbidden from recording any aspect of this conversation. But one reporter went rogue and used a very sophisticated kind of recording technology, thinking that they had captured the conversation, when in fact, all they really caught was the sound of birdsong in the DMZ. And so Haegue became really fascinated with this this moment. And so she's begun to use that bird song in different installations. So throughout the day in the atrium, you hear this very magical sound, not necessarily knowing until you read the wall text that it has this very politically charged association that I think evokes not only the conflict between and the historical tensions between North and South Korea, but also Haegue's own interest in environmental concerns as well, and just this idea of biodiversity and what we can do really to encourage diversity, not to limit it in our lives, and to really think about how we might accommodate forms of diversity in more powerful ways. Next slide, please. And she's also had a long-term fascination with Lee Sang-yoon, who is a really interesting Korean composer who, like Haegue, lived for quite a number of years in Germany, where he was really championed by a number of major composers and musicians like Stockhausen in particular. And he also became a political prisoner. And so at various points, a number of European musicians and intellectuals had to come to his defense. But like Haegue herself, he was very itinerant and passing back and forth between Europe and Asia, and his work reflected that. And I think he's become a really interesting reference in her work, again, as her work itself does, when threading together these different cultural histories in really fascinating and powerful ways. And another younger musician who's really taken his legacy very seriously is Ok-young Lee. And if you go to the next slide, please. So we invited Ok-young to come and also perform in the space. She's performed with Haegue's work a couple of times. Last year, for instance, at her exhibition at South London Gallery. Ok-young is an incredible performer. Although she's also Korean originally, she's currently based in Boston, but has been a long-term, very central figure in the downtown New York noise and experimental music scene. But increasingly, she's also interested in the sort of spatial complexity of sound. And so she spent a lot of time really analyzing both the space and Haegue's sculptures, and did this really gorgeous performance where she herself was also moving through the space, initially while the objects were static, and then increasingly while they were kinetic, while the work was being performed. So it was a really magical performance, and another way of, I think, fusing all the different elements and all the different layers of Haegue's work. What I forgot to mention is that at the end of each day, at 4 p.m. during the normal gallery hours, as the Birdsong kind of fades away, a composition by Lee Sang-yoon would begin to be played, and that's what you also heard in the background of the video recording of the performance. So I think I will leave my comments there. Very interested to hear what you all might have to say, or what questions you might have.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Stuart. I think you're so beautifully articulated the complex worlds that are contained by each individual work by Haegue, and particularly the project at MoMA. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a few images from our exhibition here and see how what you talked about resonates with the selection of work in Emergence up on the 5th floor. So this is the platform that welcomes visitors on the 5th floor, where the exhibition is on view, and it has a selection of works from the last decade that introduces really the purpose of this first encounter is to introduce the visual language and the complexity of the visual language of Haegue's work. And you'll recognize works from her different families, sonic sculptures, the intermediates that you talked about, as well as some of the light sculptures. And again, the concept of emergence for the title of the exhibition, I think, also resonates with what you were talking about in terms of her interest beyond, in terms of a more global understanding of the work. And it's that emergence is a phenomenon that it's used as a concept in natural and economic and social sciences to describe what the qualities and behaviors that an entity acquires and displays that individuals that join that entity do not have on their own, right? So it's applied to the concept of a survey exhibition. We're looking at those kind of individual works as they relate to their particular context of making, but also what happens when they merge together in the context of an exhibition, and what kinds of image of the full body of work emerges as part of that process. And here is one of the large galleries on the 5th floor that has very 22 feet high ceilings, where what we did, and again, you talked about Haegue's very sophisticated understanding of space and architecture, and this is a really daunting space. It's one of the highest ceilings in the building, and how do you really kind of inhabit that space? And with this wallpaper, eclectic totemic, I think it's really lives beautifully in the space, and it brings together some of the influences explicitly, and declares those influences and makes them visible. And we have references to figures such as Marguerite Duras and George Orwell and Igor Stravinsky, as well as the triadic ballet that it's also referenced in Boxing Ballet. But of course, the sculptures on the floor, and you mentioned the interest in Sol LeWitt, and one of those figures that she's looked at and researched in depth, and she has a whole body of work dedicated to Sol LeWitt, and particularly Sol LeWitt upside down, the sculptural structures hanging from the ceiling. And I wanted to talk about this concept of hybridity, that it's very present in individual works, but as well in her body of work overall, where she kind of goes and looks at her own, the different families of works that she's developed over time and kind of brings them together, right? And the Sol LeWitt vehicles are kind of a coming together of the dress vehicles that you mentioned, and of the Sol LeWitt upside down. And with the dress vehicle image that you showed us in her most recent exhibition, I think it was at the South London gallery, where they also had bells, right? So it's an interesting detail to consider in her work, and particularly this gallery where we put together the Sol LeWitt vehicles with the eclectic totemic is presented under the title Eclectic Affiliations and Permutations, right? And there's Salim in its location on the 5th floor, and I'm so glad you included that in your presentation, because it's something that we talked about, is kind of this performative aspect of the work, even when it's not activated by performers. And those multisensorial environments that she has developed since 2006, where those elements like fans and scent dispensers and light bulbs and heat lamps are all present to create a certain experience, a sense of experience, and an associative sense of experience. And and the crossing with the young, this is a chronology of conflated dispersion, is a project that Haegue has recently developed since 2001, and it's really kind of a biographical sculpture in a way, because she takes those two figures and details from their lives, and they lived kind of parallel lives almost. They were born around the same time and died around the same time. They never met, but nevertheless, like Gurdjieff, it's like one of those figures that she's really invested in researching their background, and she feels an affiliation due to that diasporic condition. So this is, and then here is the Boxing Ballet, the kind of the work.
Oh, that's gorgeous there. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. So this is how we install it upstairs with a spiral on the floor, and it gets activated every weekend. So there's the opportunity to see it for those of you here in Toronto. Between 2 and 4 p.m. every Saturday, we do have facilitators activating the work and making those bells really kind of create that beautiful, very gentle sound, but so beautiful of the figures moving through the space. So if there are any questions, please let us know. I guess I should be looking in the chat room. Sorry, and then I'm going to talk about another work that is in the collection. Okay, so I can't see sorry, I don't see the chat room, so I have to ask for help. Oh, there we go. Okay, now I see it. So do signal if there are any questions. And in the meantime, I'm going to talk to you and also show probably to some of you for the first time, including Stuart, the new commission, the work that Haegue created for the AGO in conjunction with the exhibition. And it's interesting that you mentioned her interest in indigenous cultures, because last summer for 2 weeks, Haegue was an artist in residence here at the AGO, and one of the activities that was part of her research was to tour the collection with various curators, including the curators of Canadian and Indigenous art. And in one of those tours, she was introduced to the wampum, the two-row Wampum Bells Treaty, which is a treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, dating back to the 17th century. And this is the title of the work, Woven Currents, Confluence of Parallels. And it has been acquired, as I mentioned, by the AGO. And when she encountered the two-row Wampum Belt Treaty, what struck her were it's a belt that is made of wampum shells. The background is white, and there's two bluish purple rows that run parallel, and they signify the destinies of the two people, the European settlers and the Haudenosaunee. And they also signify this desire to live in peace and harmony with each other and non-interference as parallel currents, right? Those are the two bodies of water, then the two people are kind of following their own trajectory without ever interfering with each other. And of course, Haegue was very much struck by the minimalist quality of the design, but also about how strongly it was expressing this desire for non-interference. And the color scheme for the installation comes from that object, from the treaty. And here she's, of course, creating a much more dynamic installation with the blinds crisscrossing and zigzagging and overlapping. And another aspect of that really inspired her and she responded to was the architectural space. And this is the sculpture court in the museum where three different moments of the architectural history of the building come together. The original Grange House that was the origin of the foundation of the museum, then the Beaux-Arts facade of the first building from 1919, and those wood panels are the part of the Frank Gehry expansion that happened 12 years ago. So she's really trying to respond to this site that has so much history made visible. And you see those two elements touching the ground, and those are flexible elements that can be pulled up when we have events happening in this space. And this connection with the ground was especially important for Haegue in conceiving this piece, because it does respond to a particular history and the physicality of the building and its presence on the land. So I'm going to stop sharing here and see if there are any questions coming from those in attendance. And I see Charlie raising it. You're muted, Charlie. You're muted.
Thank you. Her interests are so broad, and her influences seem so varied. That is there a common theme that ties her work together, or is there some common attribute throughout the work?
Stuart, do you want to take that one, or?
I'll take it on. I think, yes, I think, I mean, again, if you look at figures like Isanyun or Gurdjieff or Toiber, I mean, they were also hybrids in themselves. You know, they were all thinking across cultures. They were all thinking across mediums. Not so much Isanyun, but definitely, you know, artists like Toiber Arp have long fascinated Haegue, I think, because they were not limiting what they made to a category like art or design, but trying to kind of work across those disciplines. And I think with Solowit, I mean, she's just so rigorous, and she does work in repetitive forms. And, you know, I think she's both enamored of minimalism as much as she's also slightly critical of it. And I think because Lewitt is as much a conceptualist as a minimalist, you know, I think there's like there's an equation and a complexity in his work that has always been alluring for her. But she tends not to, I mean, even Duras, you know, I think is a different kind of writer too. So I think there is this sense of complexity and hybridity in a lot of the figures that she's drawn to.
To that, maybe I will add the idea of movement, and yes, how it's always kind of, even in, you know, that platform with the sculptures that welcomes you here at the AGO, the majority of the sculptures have the casters on, right? So she's been working with this element in her work since 2006, and it has become almost a signature, this implied and possible potential sense of movement that in a way is reflect the reality of our lives, and particularly her life as this subject moving between cultures, moving between languages, moving between actual places, and always kind of existing in multiple, locations in different ways through the work and by herself. Yeah.
I wanted to mention too when you were talking about Salim, but it was so great. Sadly we did not have Salim installed last year because we had the piece in the atrium, but MoMA also owns the Frankfurt Kitchen, which is this famous house kitchen. And so that was on view on our 5th floor. And I would love sometime to have Salim up at the same time as the Frankfurt Kitchen, because it's, again, this fascination with the Bauhaus and with a domestic space. But I think to even think about how she's now gone from this, very intimate situation of making work in her own apartment to these very large scale installations like the beautiful piece she's just done for you at AGO.
Yeah.
I have a question, Stuart. It's so interesting to me that you're overseeing media and performance at MoMA, and Salim is a work that has so many different components to it, but I would sort of classify it, if you will, as a piece of sculpture. Can you just sort of say a little bit more about how that object fits into the way that you think about collections, especially now at MoMA with this sort of wonderful new presentation that is, that you've shared with the world, less than a year hence?
I would say that we're successful if you're totally confused. And I literally just come out of a really fantastic board meeting and discussion, and we're really talking about exactly those questions right now. I mean, MoMA of all museums has always been known for its almost medieval feudal system of departments and being completely balkanized. And I have to say it's really changed so powerfully and fundamentally, even in the last 2 years. I mean, just the degree to which we're shifting towards institutional thinking that's more holistic rather than these balkanized departments that were effectively at war with each other, 20 years ago. And, I think Haegue's work, I mean, Salim is in the painting and sculpture collection rather than the media performance collection, but, I think of the work as, discussing as much as performance as it is object-based. And so this is partly, I think, why we decided to, present her so centrally in the museum, just as exactly the way that we like to start thinking and encourage our public and our community to join us in that conversation about what does it mean to still respect mediums and respect all the incredible knowledge and expertise on the part of artists, curators, connoisseurs, et cetera, who dedicate their lives to, whether it's a musical composition by Lee Sung-yoon or Korean shamanism or Bauhaus sculpture or whatever it may be, but that you can still bring those together in conversation, and that actually produces a more exciting situation for everybody.
Carol, did you have a question? It seemed like you were...
No, I was just goodbye. I think thank you.
Okay.
So it's great. I'm coming.
Yeah, please do. Thank you so much for your support. Carol and her gallery were instrumental with with everything, but especially with the commission. And so it's really nice that you could join us this evening. Thank you, Carol.
Adelina was fabulous. She was brilliant. We're so lucky. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Take care. Do we have any other questions or observations for Stuart or Adelina while we're...
We'll establish a safe bridge between New York and Toronto just to bring art refugees to Toronto.
I'm wondering about the relationship to Dada, between Dada and her work.
Very strong, very strong. I mean, she's very interested in Hugo Ball in particular, and again, the Cabaret Voltaire and the performances that happened there, and everything we've been saying, even in terms of how I think, a lot of those artists were taking sculpture, costume design, experiments in sound, and effectively, Dada is a form of collage. if you think about it. And I think that's really ultimately, if you had to limit Haegue to one medium, I would say the medium is collage, but not in terms of putting two pieces of paper together, but entire situations together. So I think Dada is as central as Bauhaus thinking, I think, for her work. So it's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're getting to that twilight hour where people are maybe transitioning to their evening, but I just want to thank you very much. I see, thank you, Laura, for your swinging goblet, and Jay, bless you. Will we raise a glass to both of you, Adelina and to Stuart, for taking us on this wonderful odyssey through the protean work of Haegue. It's really terrific, and if you haven't seen the show already, please do come and see it. And as Adelina mentioned, this weekend between 2 and 4 is a good time because you can see the Boxing Ballet activated and see the works in all their glory. So thank you all for tuning in, and take good care, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that when you do come and you see the commission that's in the Tannenbaum sculpture atrium, be sure to go take the elevator just up to the second floor to the sort of overlook, almost the mezzanine that looks into the sculpture atrium, because the commissioned work is so breathtaking from that vantage point as well. So it's interesting to get a look from below and then also semi above. Really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Lisa.
Fabulous. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks, everyone.
you.
I
Take
hope
care.
I'll-
Thank you. Thank you,
Good
Stuart.
night.
Good night.
Thank